I don't remember the exact moment my wife, Lorraine, stopped seeing me. Maybe it was gradual, like a dimming light bulb that flickers so slowly you don't notice until you're sitting in the dark. Or maybe it was sudden, like flipping a switch, the way you close a door and never look back. All I know is that one day, I was her husband. And then, without warning, I became a ghost in my own home. At first, it was subtle, missed goodnights, conversations that trailed off into nothing. Then, the distance grew louder. I'd come home from work and find her on the couch, eyes glued to her phone, barely acknowledging I was in the room. If I spoke, she'd nod, but the words never seemed to register. I wasn't sure if she even heard me anymore. I told myself it was stress, that maybe she was going through something she didn't know how to talk about. But then came the things she didn't even bother to hide. She stopped laughing at my jokes. She started dressing up to go out but never told me where she was going. She changed her phone password, even though she used to leave it lying around without a care. And the worst part? She didn't even try to lie about it. One night, as she slipped on a new dress, adjusting her hair in the mirror, I finally asked, "Are you going out?" She glanced at me through the reflection, her face unreadable. "Yeah. Where?" She sighed, almost like she was bored of the conversation before it even started. "With friends." No names. No details. Just an answer meant to shut me down. I should have pushed harder. I should have asked why she had been ignoring me for weeks, why she barely spoke to me, why it felt like I was nothing more than background noise in her life. But I didn't. Because deep down, I was afraid of the answer. And I think she knew that, too. The next morning felt like waking up in someone else's life. I rolled over, half expecting to find Lorraine still asleep, but the sheets beside me were untouched. Cold. She hadn't come to bed at all. A sinking feeling settled in my chest as I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. The house was eerily silent. No sounds from the kitchen, no shower running, no movement at all. I stepped out of the bedroom and found her sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, scrolling through her phone like I didn't exist. "Did you sleep out here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't look up. "Yeah." A pause. Nothing more. No explanation, no attempt to fill the awkward silence stretching between us. I waited for her to say something, anything, to acknowledge the growing chasm between us. But she just kept scrolling, her face bathed in the cool glow of her screen. I felt like I was going insane. This wasn't normal. We weren't fighting. We weren't yelling. There was no dramatic moment where things had fallen apart. And yet, the distance between us was suffocating. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting for her to ask how I slept, to smile at me, to be my wife again. But she never did. That day at work, I couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying the last few weeks over and over. The night she didn't come to bed. The way she barely spoke to me. The effortless way she avoided my touch. Was I imagining things? Was I overreacting? I checked my phone, hoping she'd at least text me something, maybe a simple "hope you're having a good day," like she used to. But there was nothing. By the time I got home, I had convinced myself that I needed to talk to her. No more excuses, no more ignoring the obvious. I wasn't going to let my marriage slip away without at least trying to save it. The smell of takeout filled the kitchen when I walked in. Lorraine sat at the table with a half-eaten meal in front of her, still glued to her phone. She didn't even glance up when I set my bag down. I swallowed my frustration. "We need to talk." She finally looked at me, but there was no warmth in her eyes, just mild irritation, like I had interrupted something far more important than her husband. About what? That simple question hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to scream about us. About how you don't even look at me anymore. About how it feels like I'm living with a stranger. But instead, I exhaled sharply, trying to hold myself together. About whatever's going on with you. You've been distant. You barely talk to me. I feel like I don't even know you anymore. Lorraine sighed, pushing her food around with her fork. "You're overthinking things, Owen. I've just been busy." Busy. That word felt like a slap. Too busy to say good morning? Too busy to spend time with me? Too busy to tell me where you're going at night? My voice wavered, but I didn't care. I was desperate. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "I don't have to report everything I do to you." A lump formed in my throat. She was right. She wasn't a child. She didn't know me an itinerary of her day, but this wasn't about control. This was about the fact that my wife had shut me out completely, and I had no idea why. I took a deep breath, trying one last time. "Lorraine, do you even want to be here anymore?" For a second, just a fleeting second, something passed over her face. Guilt? Hesitation? I couldn't tell. But then, just as quickly, she shrugged. "I don't know." Those 3 words cracked something inside me. I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. How do you respond to that? How do you fight for something when the other person isn't sure they even want to stay? Silence hung between us. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, but not out of anger, out of sheer helplessness. I had spent years building a life with this woman, and now she sat in front of me, acting like none of it mattered. I nodded slowly, swallowing the pain rising in my chest. Okay. And with that, I turned and walked away, because for the first time in weeks, I realized something. I wasn't the one who had left this marriage. She had. A long time ago. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling like a trespasser in my own life. The weight of Lorraine's words, "I don't know," kept repeating in my mind like a broken record. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that maybe she was just going through something personal, something she didn't know how to talk about. But the truth was sharper, colder. She didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to talk to me at all. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented by the eerie silence of the house. A glance at the clock, 2:37 a.m. I reached for Lorraine, but the bed beside me was empty, the sheets undisturbed. My stomach twisted. I sat up, listening. Nothing. No sounds from the bathroom, no faint glow from the living room. But I felt it. Something was off. Slipping out of bed, I padded barefoot down the hallway. The house was dark except for a dim light coming from the kitchen. I turned the corner, expecting to find Lorraine with a glass of water or maybe answering an email. Instead, she was sitting at the table, her back to me, phone pressed to her ear. I should have walked away. I should have respected her privacy. But something about the way she was hunched forward, whispering in that soft, careful tone, the tone she used to use with me, made me freeze. "No, he's asleep." "I checked," she murmured. A pause. A low, quiet chuckle. "I miss you too." The floor felt like it had been ripped out from under me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as if my body had shut down, refusing to process what I was hearing. My wife, the woman I had loved for years, the woman I had built a life with, was talking to someone else. Someone who wasn't me. And she sounded happy. My mind raced through every possible explanation, each one weaker than the last. Maybe it was an old friend? Maybe I misheard? Maybe. And then she said it. "I can't wait to see you again. See you again." My mouth went dry. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. Every doubt I had, every excuse I wanted to make for her, crumbled in an instant. There was no misinterpreting this. She wasn't just distant. She wasn't just stressed. She was with someone else. I backed away slowly, my pulse thundering in my ears. My first instinct was to storm in, to demand answers, to force her to look me in the eye and tell me the truth. But something stopped me. I didn't want to hear the lies she'd tell me. I turned and walked back to the bedroom, my mind blank. Lying back down, I stared at the ceiling, my heart hammering in my chest. I had suspected it for weeks, but hearing it confirmed, actually hearing her say those words, made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. I wasn't just losing my wife. I had already lost her. And she didn't even care. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I went through the motions, showered, got dressed, poured myself a cup of coffee, while Lorraine acted like nothing had happened. She hummed under her breath as she made toast, scrolling through her phone like she hadn't spent the night whispering sweet nothings to someone else. I studied her, looking for any trace of guilt, any sign that she knew I had hurt her. But there was nothing. She was unreadable, detached. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Did you sleep well?" I asked, my voice even. She glanced up, almost surprised that I had spoken. "Yeah," she said casually, taking a sip of her coffee. "You." I held her gaze, waiting for some flicker of recognition, some hesitation, anything that might suggest she knew I was onto her. But she didn't blink, didn't falter. She was a good liar. Too good. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't going to get the truth out of her. Not by asking, not by confronting her, not by clinging to whatever scraps of honesty were left between us. No, if I wanted to know the truth, the whole truth, I was going to have to find it myself. I never realized how much noise a lie could make. It wasn't loud in the traditional sense. No shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic confessions. But once you know the truth, it's everywhere. In the way she smiled at her phone but barely glanced at me. In the way she left the house without telling me where she was going. In the way she barely even pretended anymore. That morning, as Lorraine sat across from me sipping her coffee, acting like everything was fine, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. My wife, The woman I had shared my life with had been slipping away for weeks, maybe months. And now, I had proof that she had already left. I just hadn't caught up yet. But what was I supposed to do? Ask her outright? Demand answers? I wanted to. Every fiber of my being wanted to shove my chair back, slam my hands on the table, and say, I know. I heard you. Who is he? But the problem with confronting a liar is that they lie. They twist the truth until you start questioning what you know. And I wasn't going to give her that chance. So, instead, I played along. Busy day ahead? I asked, forcing my voice to sound casual as I stirred my coffee. Lorraine barely looked up. Yeah, meetings. Might be late. It was almost too easy for her. She had been doing this for so long that the lies came effortlessly. My stomach turned at the thought. I had spent years loving her, trusting her, believing that we were a team. And now? Now I was just another obstacle in her life. Something she had to work around. I nodded, acting like her words didn't cut me open. Gotcha. I'll see you later then. Her response was a distracted hum as she grabbed her bag and headed for the door. I watched her go, waiting for her to hesitate, to look back, to feel something. She didn't. The moment the door closed behind her, I exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. My heart pounded against my ribs, my mind racing. This was the moment. The moment where I had to decide what kind of man I was going to be. The old me, the trusting husband, the man who believed in second chances, would have waited. Would have convinced himself that this was salvageable, that if I just tried harder, I could bring her back. But that man was dead. And the one who remained? He wasn't going to be played for a fool. I pulled out my phone, my fingers shaking slightly as I opened a search tab. If she wasn't going to tell me the truth, I was going to find it myself. And I had a feeling it wouldn't take long. That afternoon, I left work early. Lorraine had told me she'd be at meetings. I didn't believe her. I parked a few blocks from her office and waited. I felt ridiculous at first, like some paranoid lunatic. But paranoia isn't paranoia when you're right. An hour later, she walked out of the building, not alone. A man followed close behind her, dressed in a sharp suit, his hand resting casually on her lower back as they walked toward his car. They were too comfortable with each other. Too familiar. I watched as Lorraine laughed at something he said, tilting her head in that way she used to do with me. The way she used to look at me. And just like that, there was no more doubt. No more second-guessing. I had my answer. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to storm over there, demand an explanation, force her to face me. But I knew how that would go. She'd lie. She'd gaslight. She'd spin the situation until I started questioning what I saw with my own eyes. So, instead, I sat there. I watched. I let the weight of it settle over me, pressing down on my chest until it became impossible to ignore. And for the first time in weeks, I finally accepted the truth. Lorraine had already walked away from our marriage. Now it was time for me to do the same. I sat in my car for a long time after she left with him. I don't know how long exactly, minutes, maybe an hour. Time felt distorted, stretched thin by the weight of what I had just seen. I should have been furious, should have felt my blood boil with betrayal, but all I felt was empty, hollow. Like my mind had finally stopped fighting against the truth and was just letting it sink in. Lorraine wasn't mine anymore. Maybe she hadn't been for a long time. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, staring at the cracked leather between my fingers. My whole life had been built around this marriage, this partnership that I thought was unshakable. I had spent years believing that we would always find our way back to each other, that whatever rough patches we hit, we would overcome them. But I was alone in that belief. She had already let go, and now I had a choice to make. I could stay in this moment forever, stuck in the cycle of disbelief and heartbreak, waiting for an explanation that would never come. Or I could do something about it. Slowly, I sat up, inhaling deeply as I reached for my phone. My fingers hovered over her contact name. Lorraine. It felt strange now, seeing her name there. The woman I had once adored, the woman I had built my life around, now felt like nothing more than a stranger. I wanted to call her. I wanted to say something. I saw you. I know. You don't have to lie anymore. But I didn't. Because I knew she'd lie anyway. Instead, I swiped out of the call screen and pulled up a different contact. When I got home that evening, Lorraine was already there, standing by the kitchen counter with a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up when I walked in, her face unreadable. Hey, she said, like nothing was wrong. Like she hadn't just spent the afternoon in another man's car. I studied her for a moment, feeling an odd sense of detachment. Was this the same woman I had once planned my future with? The same woman I had once trusted with my whole heart? I got a call today, I said, setting my keys down on the table. She arched a brow, sipping her wine. Oh, yeah, from the landlord. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. He wanted to know if we were renewing the lease. Her hand tensed slightly around the glass, but her expression remained neutral. And I shrugged. Told him I'd get back to him. Figured we should talk about it first. There it was, the flicker of hesitation, the brief moment where she realized that I wasn't playing dumb anymore. Owen, she started, her voice suddenly softer. I know things have been weird between us lately. Weird. That was one way to put it. She set her glass down and stepped toward me, as if suddenly remembering how to act like a wife. I don't want to fight. I think we just need time to figure things out. I almost laughed. Now she wanted to figure things out? No. After weeks of ignoring me? After lying to my face? But I didn't let my emotions show. I just nodded. Yeah, maybe. She smiled slightly, relieved that I wasn't pushing her. That was the problem with Lorraine. She never wanted consequences. She wanted things to resolve themselves without effort. I turned away, heading to the bedroom. I'm gonna shower. She didn't stop me. She didn't ask me to talk. Because deep down, she had to know what was coming. I waited until late that night to do what needed to be done. When Lorraine was asleep, curled up on her side of the bed like everything was fine, I quietly got up and went to the closet. I packed. Not in a dramatic, angry way. I didn't shove clothes into a suitcase or break things in frustration. I just packed. Methodically. Calmly. Like a man who had finally made peace with something he should have realized a long time ago. I didn't take everything. Just what I needed. Just enough to walk away without looking back. As I zipped up my bag, I glanced toward the bed one last time. Lorraine was still asleep, unaware that the life we had built together was ending right in front of her. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. Because I wasn't waiting anymore. The air felt heavier that morning. Not in a suffocating way, but in a way that made everything feel strangely final. The kind of heaviness that comes with the end of something long overdue. I had spent the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of Lorraine's breathing beside me. It used to bring me comfort. Now, it just reminded me of the lie we were living. I had already packed most of my things, stashed away in the back seat of my car where she wouldn't see. I had no interest in a dramatic departure, no scene, no heated confrontation where we exchanged words neither of us could take back. I was past that. I was past her. As I moved through the kitchen, making myself a final cup of coffee in what was once her home, I heard her stir. Footsteps approached from the bedroom, soft and lazy, like she had all the time in the world. She entered the kitchen, stretching, barely glancing in my direction before heading straight for the coffee pot. Morning, she mumbled. I watched her for a moment, taking in the sheer normalcy of it all. The woman who had ignored me for weeks, the woman who had laughed into the phone with someone else while I lay just feet away, now stood here, acting like nothing had changed. Maybe, to her, nothing had. Maybe she really thought I'd stay in this limbo forever. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch. When she finally turned and noticed me staring, she furrowed her brow. You okay? That was the moment. The moment where I could have called her out, thrown the truth in her face, demanded to know why she had done it. But what was the point? I had seen everything I needed to see. Heard everything I needed to hear. I set my mug down with a soft clink. Yeah, I said. I am. She nodded, a little wary now, but still unconcerned. I might be late again tonight. Work stuff. That was the final confirmation I needed. She wasn't even trying anymore. The lies had become second nature, slipping past her lips with ease, as if my absence in her life was something she had already adjusted to. I exhaled slowly, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. All right, I said. I'll see you later then. She nodded, already moving on, already scrolling through her phone. She didn't notice when I grabbed my keys. Didn't notice the way my grip tightened around them, how I looked around the kitchen one last time. She didn't notice when I walked to the door, or when I didn't say goodbye. Walking away felt surreal. The moment my feet crossed the threshold, I expected something to hit me, a wave of regret, a pang of doubt, a final, desperate urge to turn back. But there was nothing. Just the sound of the door clicking shut behind me. The world outside felt different. Lighter. As if the weight of that house, that life, had been pressing down on me without me even realizing it. I slid into my car, gripping the steering wheel, my pulse steady. The street was quiet, the morning sun just beginning to paint the sky in warm hues. Everything looked the same as it had every other day. But for me, nothing was the same. I didn't look back. Not when I started the engine. Not when I pulled away. Not when I left behind the woman who had already left me. I didn't owe her a fight. I didn't owe her an argument. And I sure as hell didn't owe her my heartbreak. For the first time in a long time, I was finally moving forward. The first thing I noticed after leaving was the silence. Not the heavy, suffocating silence that had filled my house for weeks, the one that made me feel like a stranger in my own marriage. No, this was different. This was a peaceful silence, a kind of quiet that didn't feel oppressive but freeing. I drove aimlessly for a while, letting the weight of the moment settle in. The city moved around me like it always did, people rushing to work, the morning radio buzzing in the background, coffee cups balanced in one hand while phones were held in the other. Life didn't stop just because my world had shifted. And in a way, that was a relief. But I had no plan, no destination, just a bag of my things in the back seat and a realization that I was now officially untethered. No wife waiting for me at home. No routine to fall back on. I had spent so long clinging to a version of my marriage that no longer existed that I hadn't considered what came next. I pulled into the parking lot of a diner, the kind of place that had probably been around for decades, with its faded sign and the promise of bottomless coffee. It felt like the right kind of place to sit and think. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, poured me a cup before I even asked. "Rough morning?" she asked with a knowing smile. I let out a breath, laughing slightly. Something like that. She nodded like she had seen 100 men sit in this same booth, with the same expression, holding the same kind of heartbreak. "You need anything, hon? You just let me know." I thanked her and wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. It was strange how small comforts could feel so significant when your whole world felt uncertain. I checked my phone. Nothing from Lorraine. Not that I expected anything, but a part of me, some foolish, old part, had wondered if she'd notice I was gone. If she'd text, if she'd ask where I was, if she'd care. But the screen remained empty. Maybe that was my answer. I didn't want to spiral into what-ifs. I didn't want to sit here, analyzing every moment of our downfall. I had spent weeks, months even, trying to fix something she had already walked away from. I was done fighting for someone who wouldn't even lift a finger for me. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed closure, not for her, not for the marriage, but for myself. I couldn't just disappear into the world and pretend this never happened. I needed to see her one last time. I drove back to the house later that afternoon, not because I had changed my mind, but because I wanted to be the one to end things on my terms. I refused to let my story end with me sneaking away while she scrolled through her phone, unaware of what she had lost. When I walked inside, she was sitting on the couch, legs curled under her, watching TV. She barely glanced up when I entered, as if I had just returned from running an errand instead of disappearing from her life entirely. I set my keys on the counter. "We need to talk." She sighed, pausing the show. "Owen, I really don't feel like having a long conversation right now." That was it. That was all she had to say. Not "where were you?" Not "why did you leave?" Just an impatient sigh, like I was some inconvenience she had to deal with before getting back to her evening. I exhaled slowly, my hands resting on my hips as I studied her. This woman sitting in front of me, the woman I had once adored, the woman I had built a life with, felt like a stranger. And maybe she always had been. Maybe I had been blind to it all along. "I'm leaving," I said, voice steady. She blinked, her expression finally shifting into something other than boredom. "What?" "I'm done," I continued. "I packed my things this morning. I just came back to tell you that I'm not coming back." "You don't love me, Lorraine." "Maybe you never did." A flicker of something crossed her face. Guilt? Panic? Regret? It didn't matter anymore. She opened her mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to defend herself, but I shook my head. "I don't need explanations. I don't need excuses. I heard you on the phone." "I know." Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time in weeks, she looked like she had lost control of the situation. Like she hadn't expected me to stand up for myself. I grabbed my keys again, turning for the door. "Take care of yourself, Lorraine." And with that, I walked out, leaving her behind for good. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, I was finally free. The sun was setting as I drove away for the last time, casting warm streaks of orange and pink across the sky. It was strange, just hours ago, I had felt like my entire world was collapsing. But now? Now I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Relief. No more walking on eggshells. No more wondering if Lorraine would ever love me the way she once did. No more trying to fix something that had been broken long before I even noticed the cracks. The weight I had been carrying for weeks, maybe even months, was finally gone. I drove with no real destination in mind, but for the first time, that didn't scare me. The idea of starting over, of rebuilding my life without her, wasn't something I feared anymore. It was something I welcomed. After a while, I pulled into a small motel off the highway, the kind of place that wasn't fancy but had a bed and a door I could close behind me. That was all I needed for now. I checked in, dropped my bag on the chair, and sank onto the mattress, letting out a slow breath. And then, for the first time in weeks, I smiled. Not a forced smile. Not a smile I put on to convince myself everything was okay. A real, honest smile. Because for all the heartbreak, for all the pain of losing someone I had once loved, I had gained something much more valuable. Myself. I had spent so much time fighting for a marriage that no longer existed that I had forgotten who I was. What I wanted. And now, for the first time in a long time, I had the chance to figure that out. I pulled out my phone, ignoring the lack of messages from Lorraine, and scrolled through my contacts. I stopped at a name I hadn't reached out to in years, my old friend Malcolm. We had lost touch over time, but he was the kind of friend who would answer, no matter how long it had been. I hit call. After a few rings, his voice came through. Owen? Damn, man, it's been a minute. I laughed, leaning back on the pillows. Yeah, listen. I'm in town for a while. Thought maybe we could grab a drink. Malcolm didn't hesitate. Hell yeah. You okay? I thought about it for a second, about everything I had been through, about how lost I had felt just this morning. And then I realized something. Yeah, I said, smiling again. I think I will be. And just like that, I took the first step forward. Not toward the past, not toward regret, but toward a future that, for the first time in a long time, was mine.